I used to believe that if you stayed quiet and respectful, people would let you look around in peace. But then one afternoon changed that belief completely. The gallery smelled of polished wood and fresh paint, nothing like the diner where I usually spent my afternoons after school. I had just finished a shift wiping tables and still wore my school polo and worn sneakers. In my backpack, pressed close to my chest, was a sketchbook I carried everywhere. I wasn't here to cause any trouble. I just wanted to see a portrait I'd admired for months online, a piece I thought would inspire my own work. The room was silent, except for the soft echo of my steps on the polished floor. Wealthy clients in linen clothes whispered in low voices, sipping sparkling water. At the center of it all stood Mr. Whitaker, the gallery manager, in a navy blazer, and a smile that seemed rehearsed. I tried to walk straight toward the portrait. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. "Look with your whole heart, Maya, not just your eyes." But before I could get close, I heard a polite but firm voice. "Miss, may I help you?" He stepped into my path, and suddenly the entire room's attention shifted toward me. His gaze didn't rest on my face, but moved slowly from my sneakers to my school uniform, as if measuring whether I belonged. "I'm just here for a school project," I said, steadying my voice. I didn't mention the scholarship email folded in my sketchbook or the hours I spent sketching by the soda crates in the diner's back room. That was mine to keep, for now. His smile tightened. "These pieces are quite valuable," he said in a tone that felt more like a warning than a welcome. "We keep visits very curated." I felt a knot in my stomach, but held my ground. "I promise I won't touch anything. I only want to study the brushwork." For a moment, his eyes flickered with surprise, maybe because I knew the right words, but then his expression hardened again. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable joining one of our student group tours later this week. This afternoon is for private clients." The words stung. Behind him, a pair of customers glanced at me, and then at each other with faint, knowing smiles. Someone let out a quiet laugh, as if they already knew how this would end. I could have apologized and left. That's what I'd been taught growing up in a small town. Don't make a scene. Don't give anyone a reason to say you don't belong. But something inside me resisted. My grandmother always said, when someone shuts a door, remember, it's only wood and hinges. Build your own if you have to. So I straightened my posture and asked, "What would you recommend I read to better understand the artist's earlier work?" The silence that followed was heavy. He glanced at me, then at a stack of glossy catalogs priced far beyond what I could afford. "We do have catalogs," he said slowly, "but again, this afternoon is private." I nodded once, pressing my fingers into the seam of my sketchbook. I didn't want to show the heat rising in my face. Instead, I took out my phone and quickly typed brushwork, layering, contemporary portrait styles. He watched me as if I'd stolen something. Maybe I had. Maybe I'd stolen back a little dignity. As I turned toward the door, my eyes caught the portrait one last time. It was a woman's face, soft yet strong, shadows curving across her cheek like unspoken stories. For me, it looked like my mother, after long nights at the diner, still smiling even when she was tired. That was what I wanted to remember. Not his words, not the stares. Just her. Outside, the air was hot and filled with the sound of car horns and music spilling from a food truck down the block. I walked quickly, clutching my backpack. By the time I reached the diner, the smell of sizzling carne and warm tortillas wrapped around me like a blanket. My mother noticed my expression right away. She didn't press me, not at first. She simply set a plate in front of me, enchiladas verdes with rice, and nudged my elbow. "Eat," she said. When I didn't, she touched my sketchbook gently. "Tell me." So I told her. About the way he stood in my path, about the way the room felt like it was voting me out. She listened, her arms crossed, her face calm in a way that reminded me of storms that don't need thunder to be dangerous. Finally, she said, "Some people live so high up, they forget what the ground feels like. Don't let them trick you into forgetting who you are." That night, when the diner closed, I sat in the storage room with the smell of limes and cumin thick in the air. I pulled out my sketchbook and unfolded the scholarship letter. Regional finalist, Lone Star Youth Arts Showcase. I traced the words with my pencil, reminding myself that one person's doubt didn't cancel out my work. I sketched until my wrist ached, line after line, shading until the woman in my memory, the one in the painting, the one like my mother, emerged on the page. Then I taped a square of bright pink papel picado above the letter, a gift from a friend who told me it meant luck. I used to think art needed permission. That day I realized I couldn't wait for anyone's key. If the door stayed closed, I'd have to build one I could carry with me. The next week at school felt heavier than usual. While my classmates laughed in the cafeteria or rushed to practice, I sat under the oak tree near the parking lot, sketchbook open on my knees. I wasn't just drawing anymore. I was building armor. Each line, each shade of graphite was like a brick wall between me and the memory of that gallery. Still, the whispers sometimes followed me. Why do you spend so much time drawing? Nobody makes a living off sketches. Or, you? An art showcase finalist, please. They weren't meant to be cruel, not always. But they carried the same weight as Mr. Whitaker's smile at the gallery. A weight that pressed down until breathing itself felt like work. I swallowed those doubts the same way I swallowed the tiredness from working late at the diner. Quietly, without complaint. My mother needed the extra shifts covered, and I knew every tip I earned meant we were closer to covering rent. I told myself, one day, they'll understand. Late at night, after homework and cleaning tables, I would sit by the kitchen window, a single bulb buzzing overhead. I drew with what little strength I had left, sometimes dozing off with my pencil still in hand. My sketches grew sharper, bolder. Faces of women who reminded me of my grandmother. Wrinkles like maps of sacrifice, eyes still fierce with dignity. Men like my father, who I barely remembered but knew had crossed a border with nothing but hope. I drew until I believed the paper itself could speak for them. Sometimes I'd stop, rub my eyes, and whisper to myself, just a little longer, Maya. Keep going. One evening, while cleaning up at the diner, I overheard two regulars talking about the art showcase. Big sponsors will be there this year, one said. The kind of people who can change a young artist's life overnight. My heart leapt and sank all at once. Sponsors. Patrons. The kind of people who lived in the world of galleries and glass doors. The very world that had already decided I didn't belong. I clenched the rag in my hands and whispered, we'll see about that. At school, I kept mostly to myself, but one person noticed. Elena, my best friend since kindergarten. She was Mexican-American too, like me, but loud where I was quiet, bold where I hesitated. One afternoon, she sat next to me under the oak tree, biting into a bag of hot chips, her nails painted neon pink. You've been different lately, she said. What happened? I hesitated, then told her everything about the gallery. Every detail, down to the smirks, the way the air in the room turned heavy. Elena's face grew red. Maya, that's disgusting. They can't just... She stopped, shaking her head. You know what? Forget them. You're going to crush that showcase. And when you do, they'll wish they'd treated you differently. Her words burned like fire in my chest. I wanted to believe them, but part of me still doubted. What if they're right, Elena? What if I don't belong in that world? She grabbed my sketchbook, flipping through page after page. Look at this. Look at what you can do with a pencil. If they can't see it, that's their blindness, not your lack of talent. She handed it back firmly. Promise me you'll show them who you are. I nodded, though my throat was tight. The following days were a blur of preparation. I submitted my final portfolio to the showcase, 5 portraits that told a story of struggle, resilience, and quiet power. Each one felt like a piece of my heart pressed onto paper. When I sealed the envelope, my hands trembled, but inside, something whispered, this time, the door won't shut. Weeks later, the letter arrived. My mother was the one who found it in the mailbox. She burst through the diner's kitchen doors, waving it in the air like a flag of victory. Maya, she shouted, ignoring the startled customers. You got in! You're a finalist! The diner erupted into cheers from the few who knew us, but my mother pulled me close, her eyes wet. Do you see me, Nina? All your nights, all your silence. It wasn't for nothing. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing both the cheers and the faint laughter from the gallery echoing in my ears. I thought of Elena's words. "Show them who you are." I whispered to myself, "I will." What I never expected was that fate would give me a chance to prove it, not in some faraway hall, but right back in the very place where I'd been humiliated. The night of the showcase arrived like a storm I'd been bracing for. Boston's downtown was glowing, every street buzzing with life, and the gallery windows shone like they were daring me to step back into a world that once pushed me out. I stood outside for a moment, clutching my sketch portfolio, my palms sweaty despite the cool evening air. My mother squeezed my hand. "Maya, remember, dignity first. You belong here." Inside, the space looked exactly as I remembered: polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and laughter that sounded more like whispers of judgment than joy. Only this time, my name was on the program. Finalist, Maya Alvarez. As I walked deeper into the room, my eyes caught on a face I wished I wouldn't see: Mr. Whitaker. He stood with his usual group of well-dressed patrons, wine glass in hand, telling stories with that same confident smirk. The same man who once told me without words that I didn't belong. For a moment, my knees wavered, but then Elena's voice rang in my mind. "Show them who you are." When the finalists were announced, I took my place alongside other young artists. Their canvases glowed under the lights, grand oil paintings, massive sculptures. And then there were my 5 charcoal portraits, simple, black and white, but alive with soul. At first, people only glanced at my work politely before moving on. But then one man stopped, then another. Soon, a small crowd formed, murmuring quietly, pointing to the details: the weathered lines in the grandmother's face, the hopeful gleam in the young boy's eyes. A hush spread through the room, a different kind of silence than last time. Not ridicule, curiosity, respect. Then, of all people, Mr. Whitaker stepped closer. His glass paused halfway to his lips, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in to study my signature. His smirk faltered. "Maya Alvarez?" he muttered, almost to himself. I stepped forward, my voice steady though my heart pounded. "Yes, sir. The same girl you turned away from this gallery a few months ago." Gasps rippled through the small crowd. A woman whispered, "Wait, she's the one?" Whitaker's face paled slightly, though he tried to laugh it off. "Well, I see you've improved." I met his gaze squarely, refusing to let him slip away so easily. "I didn't improve overnight, sir. I was always this artist. You just couldn't see past my school uniform." The words hung heavy in the air, sharper than any sketch line I'd ever drawn. Patrons who once chuckled behind their glasses now stood frozen, watching the man they admired get called out by the very teenager he dismissed. Whitaker opened his mouth, but no defense came. Instead, the director of the showcase, an older woman with kind but piercing eyes, stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker, thank you for your perspective," she said curtly. Then she turned to me, her tone softening. "Miss Alvarez, your work speaks volumes. It's honest. It's alive. Exactly what this showcase was meant to celebrate." The crowd erupted into applause. Real applause. My cheeks flushed, but this time with pride, not shame. Whitaker stepped back, his face tight, clearly realizing that the balance of the room had shifted. For once, his charm couldn't save him. The smirk was gone. As the applause continued, I looked at my mother. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her smile was radiant. Elena whooped from the back, clapping louder than anyone, shouting, "That's my best friend!" And me? I stood taller than I ever had before. For months, I carried the weight of humiliation, but in that single moment, the truth had flipped everything upside down. What I never expected was that this twist, this one confrontation, would not just change how they saw me, but how they saw every kid like me who walked into a room full of glass doors. The applause faded into murmurs, and suddenly the air inside the gallery felt different. People weren't just looking at my drawings anymore, they were looking at me. Not with ridicule, but with the curiosity and respect that should have been there all along. And then, almost like a ripple through the crowd, the whispers started. "Did you hear what she said? He turned her away? That's shameful, and he's supposed to be a mentor to young artists." I watched Whitaker's jaw tighten. He tried to smile, lifting his glass like nothing had happened, but I could see it. The shift. The same people who once laughed at his jokes now avoided his eyes. A few patrons who had always hovered around him like moths to a flame quietly drifted away, pretending to be interested in other displays. His polished confidence had cracks, and everyone could see them. For the first time, I realized that humiliation cuts both ways. The showcase director leaned toward me quietly. "You've done more tonight than win applause, Maya. You've reminded this room what real art and real dignity looks like." Her words gave me a kind of validation I hadn't dared to dream of. Meanwhile, Elena had somehow worked her way through the crowd and grabbed my shoulders. "Maya, do you realize what you just did? You flipped the script right in front of everyone. That man will never forget this night." She laughed, but her eyes shone with pride. My mother wiped her cheeks and whispered, "You showed them, mihija, with grace." She kissed my forehead, and I felt her pride settle deep in my chest like armor. But across the room, Whitaker was unraveling. He cornered one of the patrons, his voice low but sharp, as though desperate to justify himself. She misunderstood. I wasn't rude. I was simply busy that day. The man he spoke to nodded politely, but quickly excused himself. Whitaker's eyes darted around, searching for someone else to validate him, but found only backs turning away. That was when it hit me. The real consequence wasn't me humiliating him. It was him exposing himself. By dismissing me, he had revealed something about his own character that couldn't be hidden under expensive suits and practiced smiles anymore. Later that evening, the winners were announced. I didn't take first place, but when my name was called for the Audience Choice Award, the entire room erupted in cheers. The same crowd that once looked at me like I didn't belong now stood applauding like I was one of their own. And in that moment, I didn't need a trophy. The recognition itself was enough. As the night wound down, something else happened I'll never forget. Daniel Ramirez, a well-known gallery owner from New York, approached me with a warm smile. "Maya," he said, handing me his card, "I think your work has something rare, soul. If you're interested, I'd love to feature you in our upcoming youth exhibition." My hands trembled as I took the card. "Thank you. I'd be honored." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Whitaker watching. His face was pale, his glass still in his hand but untouched. For once, the room that had always belonged to him didn't. On the ride home, Elena couldn't stop replaying the moment. "The look on his face when you introduced yourself? Priceless. I swear I'll be telling my grandkids about that one day." But for me, the victory wasn't about revenge. Sitting in the back seat of my mother's car, I realized I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. The shame I had carried for weeks had lifted, replaced by something stronger. Proof that dignity and patience had power. The consequences for Whitaker were just beginning. Within days, word spread through the art community. Some said his mentorship style had always been questionable. Others admitted they'd ignored his arrogance for too long. Invitations to events that once came flooding his inbox began to slow. Patrons quietly shifted their support elsewhere. And me? I found myself busier than ever. Schoolwork, commissions, meetings with new mentors who actually believed in me. I wasn't just redefining how others saw me. I was redefining how I saw myself. I used to think one cruel moment could define me forever. But what I never expected was that it could also become the very spark that redefined my entire future. The days after the showcase felt almost unreal. I went back to school, sketchbook under my arm as always, but something inside me had shifted. The same halls that once felt heavy with doubt now felt lighter, like I was finally walking in my own skin. Friends who used to tease me about dreaming too big now stopped to ask about my art. Even teachers who barely noticed me before suddenly encouraged me to keep going. But the real change wasn't outside. It was in me. For the first time, I stopped replaying Whitaker's words in my head. Instead, I replayed the sound of the audience clapping, the look of pride on my mother's face, the card Daniel Ramirez had pressed into my hand. I realized something important. Dignity is like a quiet flame. Even when people try to smother it with contempt, it can still burn strong if you protect it. Whitaker, on the other hand, wasn't doing so well. Word traveled fast in the Boston art scene. I heard from Elena that two local galleries had quietly paused their collaborations with him. A few of his longtime patrons pulled out of contracts. No one publicly denounced him, but the silence was louder than words. In an industry built on reputation, Whitaker's arrogance had finally cost him the thing he valued most: credibility. And maybe that was justice enough. He had humiliated himself without me lifting a finger. One Saturday afternoon, I sat at my father's old drafting table, the one he had used back in Mexico before he moved us here. Its surface was covered in nicks, scratches, and little doodles from when I was a kid. For years, I had been too afraid to take up his mantle fully, worried I wasn't good enough. But now, as I traced my pencil across the page, I felt something new: permission. Permission to be myself, to chase this path, no matter who tried to tell me I didn't belong. My mother walked in quietly with a cup of tea. She set it down, then leaned against the doorway, watching me work. "Maya," she said softly, "you know what your father used to tell me? He said, respect is not given by titles or money. It's given by how you treat the person standing right in front of you." She smiled, her eyes warm. "You showed that truth better than any lecture ever could." I didn't answer right away. I just let her words sink in, knowing she was right. Life didn't magically get perfect after that night. People still judged me sometimes. Strangers still looked at my secondhand clothes or my brown skin and made quiet assumptions. But the difference was, I no longer carried those judgments as my burden. I learned to let them stay where they belonged, with the people who made them. And every time doubt crept in, I remembered that moment on stage. The silence that turned into applause. The truth that revealed itself louder than any insult. Because here's the lesson: you don't need to shout to prove your worth. Sometimes standing your ground with quiet courage is the loudest statement of all. Whitaker's story faded into the background, but mine was just beginning. A few months later, one of my paintings hung in Ramirez's New York gallery, right beside artists I'd once only admired from afar. People didn't ask about my sneakers or my accent. They asked about my art. And every time they did, I smiled, because I knew how hard I'd fought to reach that moment. I used to think humiliation could break me. But what I never expected was that it could also become the soil where resilience grew. And maybe that's the real message I want to leave behind. Never let someone else's prejudice define you. Their laughter, their smirks, their dismissive words, those say nothing about your worth. They only reveal the limits of their own vision. As for me, I'll keep drawing. I'll keep telling stories through lines and colors. And I'll keep reminding myself, and anyone who listens, that dignity isn't given, it's claimed. Because at the end of the day, no insult is stronger than the quiet power of knowing who you are. The weeks that followed felt like living in two different worlds. At school, life went on as usual. Teachers giving pop quizzes, students rushing between classes, the cafeteria always running out of the good food first. But beyond those walls, something larger was unfolding. People had heard what happened at the showcase, and whispers turned into conversations. It started small. A local art blogger wrote a piece titled "When Humility Outshines Arrogance" about my story. Then a community radio station invited me in for a short interview. I was nervous, my voice trembling as I spoke into the microphone, but I told the truth. It's not about me. It's about how many young people are told they don't belong in places that should welcome everyone. The host nodded, and when the segment aired, my classmates looked at me differently. Then came the bigger wave. A Boston newspaper published an article, this time naming Whitaker. The headline read, "Local Gallery Faces Backlash Over Discriminatory Conduct." Whitaker had always thrived on attention, but this was the kind he couldn't control. Patrons began asking uncomfortable questions. A few pulled funding entirely. One gallery director wrote an open letter about the need for inclusivity in the arts, directly referencing my experience. For the first time, the art world wasn't just talking about color on canvas, but color of skin, and how often it was still used as a barrier. At first, I wasn't sure I wanted to be at the center of it all. I was just 17, trying to pass algebra and finish my sketches on time. But when I walked through my neighborhood and older folks stopped me, people who'd worked 2 or 3 jobs their whole lives, who rarely had the luxury of visiting art galleries, they'd say things like, "Mija, you made us proud," or "You spoke for all of us." That's when I realized this wasn't just my fight. Meanwhile, Whitaker's decline became more visible. I heard from Elena that he tried hosting a special exhibition to prove he was still relevant, but only a handful of people showed up. His once booming social media pages were full of criticism and disappointment. For a man who built his identity on control, the unraveling must have felt like slow suffocation. But the story wasn't just about his fall. It was also about who rose. Daniel, the young assistant who had stood up for me, suddenly found himself recognized too. People appreciated his honesty, his willingness to speak out even when his job was on the line. Ramirez offered him a position at his gallery, saying, "We need more young men like you." The relief on Daniel's face when he told me this was unforgettable, like a weight had been lifted. And me? I started receiving letters, real letters, written on lined paper or colorful stationery, mostly from kids my age across the city. Some wrote about being overlooked because of how they dressed. Others wrote about being the only immigrant in their class, or the only person of color in a program. Their words were raw. They told me I'd never make it. Sometimes I pretend not to hear the comments. I don't know how to fight back without getting in trouble. I read every letter. Sometimes I cried. Sometimes I laughed. But every single one reminded me of something my father had always said. La lucha no es solo tuya. The struggle isn't just yours. One Saturday, my mother and I organized a small community art workshop at our church's basement. It wasn't fancy. Folding tables, crayons, paintbrushes, and donated sketch pads. But kids showed up, lots of them. Their parents stayed too, curious, supportive. We drew murals together, telling stories through color. When one little girl held up her drawing of a butterfly and whispered, "This is me," I knew something was shifting. The humiliation I faced that night at the showcase had been sharp and painful. But now, weeks later, I began to see that pain transformed into something else. Fuel. It wasn't just about proving Whitaker wrong anymore. It was about proving that entire communities could rise above the weight of prejudice. Still, I was human. There were nights I lay awake, wondering if this sudden attention would fade, or if I'd be able to carry the responsibility people were placing on me. But each time doubt whispered, I remembered the look on Whitaker's face when the truth hit him, and the sound of that applause that drowned out his arrogance. That moment had carved something deep inside me, a reminder that dignity, once defended, can never be taken away again. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. Whitaker had always been a man who thrived on image. To him, perception was everything. The shine of his suits, the sharpness of his words, the exclusivity of the company he kept. So when the backlash began, he refused to believe it would last. "It's a news cycle," he told his colleagues. "People will forget." But they didn't. Weeks later, I heard he was planning a grand relaunch exhibition. Flyers went out, carefully designed, with glossy photos and promises of new era of inclusivity and vision. He tried to paint himself as a man reformed. Some bought into it. But most people who had witnessed what happened to me remembered too clearly. Elena, the assistant who had always trailed after him nervously, quit quietly one morning. "I can't work for someone who pretends change while refusing to face his own mistakes," she told a friend, who later passed the words back to me. Still, Whitaker pressed on. The night of the exhibition, the gallery was dressed to impress. Champagne on silver trays, soft lighting, and a string quartet in the corner. He had invited every influential figure he could, desperate to reclaim his throne. I didn't plan on going. Truthfully, I was tired of him, tired of his shadow hovering over me. But Ramirez called that afternoon. "Maya, you should come," he said gently. "Why? To watch him put on another performance?" I asked. Ramirez chuckled, though his voice held gravity. "Because sometimes the most powerful thing isn't revenge. its presence. When people see you standing tall, it reminds them what really happened. So I went. Walking into that gallery, I felt a shiver of déjà vu. The same walls, the same polished floors. But this time, I wasn't walking in as a girl waiting for permission to belong. I was walking in knowing I already belonged, anywhere I chose. Whitaker spotted me instantly. His practiced smile flickered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered. He strutted over, glass of champagne in hand, his voice booming so everyone nearby could hear. "Ah, Maya Alvarez," he said as if he were the gracious host greeting an old friend. "I'm glad you decided to join us tonight." I simply nodded. "I came to see the art." A few people nearby smirked knowingly. The tension in the room shifted. Whitaker launched into a speech soon after, standing at the center of the gallery. His voice carried, rehearsed, and full of self-importance. "Tonight marks a new chapter," he declared. "This gallery has always been about vision, about excellence, about pushing boundaries." But then something happened he didn't expect. A voice from the crowd cut through his speech. "Excellence? Like humiliating a young student in front of everyone?" A murmur rippled through the room. Whitaker faltered, his jaw tightening. He scanned the crowd, but before he could respond, another person spoke up. "Did you ever apologize to her or to the community?" Now the room buzzed with whispers. People were no longer politely sipping champagne. They were staring, waiting. Whitaker's face flushed. He forced a laugh. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." But the crowd wasn't buying it. A man in the back raised his phone, playing a clip someone had secretly recorded at the showcase. Whitaker's mocking words, the dismissal, the snickers. The sound echoed across the gallery like a haunting reminder. The color drained from Whitaker's face. His carefully crafted facade crumbled right there in front of everyone. I stood silently in the corner, watching. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness that people like him had the power to wound so deeply, but relief that finally he couldn't hide anymore. One by one, guests began leaving. Some shook their heads in disappointment. Others muttered about never supporting this place again. Even the quartet stopped playing, their bows hovering awkwardly before lowering altogether. Whitaker tried desperately to call them back, to salvage the evening, but his words fell flat in the hollowing room. By the time I turned to leave, half the gallery was empty. Outside, the crisp night air hit my face, carrying the faint smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor on the corner. Ramirez walked out beside me, a proud smile in his eyes. "You see?" he said softly. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need you to shout it. It shouts for itself." I nodded, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Whitaker had been exposed, not because I fought him with anger, but because the truth simply refused to stay hidden. That night, as I walked home past the brick sidewalks and glowing street lamps of my neighborhood, I thought of my father's words again. La lucha no es solo tuya. This wasn't just my battle. It was everyone's who had ever been told you don't belong. And though Whitaker's empire was cracking, I realized my story was no longer about him at all. It was about what came next. After Whitaker's disastrous exhibition, the city buzzed for weeks. Local blogs, community pages, even radio talk shows kept repeating the same theme, the young woman who stood her ground. At first, it made me uncomfortable. I didn't set out to be anyone's symbol. I just wanted to protect my dignity. But little by little, I realized something deeper. People weren't only talking about me, they were talking about themselves. One evening, I stopped by Ramirez's small studio. The smell of turpentine mixed with coffee filled the air, canvases leaned against the walls, and his radio played an old salsa tune. He looked up, eyes warm. "You've started something bigger, Maya," he said. "People are paying attention now. They're waiting to see what you'll do next." I frowned. "What can I really do? I'm just one student." Ramirez chuckled, brushing paint across a canvas. "One voice becomes many when it's honest. That's how change starts." The next week, I received an invitation from the local library to speak at a youth event. The director, a Cuban-American woman named Marisol, told me, "Maya, these kids need to hear from someone like you. They're growing up being told they're not enough. Show them that they are. I almost turned it down. Public speaking made my stomach twist. But I remembered the stares at Whitaker's gallery, the way people whispered, the way silence had weighed heavier than bricks. And I thought, if I don't speak, that silence wins again. So I agreed. The night of the event, the library's community room was packed. Brown and black teens filled every chair, some leaning against bookshelves, others cross-legged on the floor. Parents stood in the back, arms crossed with cautious hope in their eyes. I stood at the podium, palms damp. For a moment, my voice caught in my throat. Then I remembered my father's words, "La lucha no es solo tuya," and I began. I used to think that keeping my head down would protect me, I said quietly. That if I stayed silent, the world would leave me alone. But silence doesn't protect dignity. It hides it. And one day, someone tried to take mine away. The room was silent, everyone listening. I told them about the gallery, the humiliation, the whispers that cut sharper than knives. But I also told them about resilience, about standing tall even when your knees shake, about choosing to walk back in the next day, not as a victim, but as someone who knew her worth. When I finished, a girl about 15 raised her hand. Her voice trembled. People laugh at me at school because of my accent. I thought, maybe I should just stop speaking up in class. But hearing you, maybe I shouldn't. Her words hit me harder than anything Whitaker had ever said. In her eyes, I saw myself. And for the first time, I understood. My story wasn't just mine anymore. That night, I walked out of the library into the cool Boston air with a heart that felt strangely lighter. It wasn't about proving Whitaker wrong anymore. It was about helping others believe in their right to belong. Over the following months, invitations kept coming. Churches, community centers, even local colleges asked me to share my story. Each time I hesitated. Each time I said yes. With every speech, I became less nervous, more grounded. I began weaving in stories of my father's journey as an immigrant mason, my mother's nights working double shifts, my grandmother's proverbs about dignity. I saw eyes glisten, heads nod, kids straighten their backs like maybe they too could stand taller. Meanwhile, Whitaker's name faded. His gallery, once the talk of the city, lost its luster. People said he moved to another town, trying to start over. But he was no longer the center of my story. One late afternoon, as I walked home past murals painted by local artists, bold colors of resilience and hope, I felt something new in my chest. Not just pride, but purpose. I had gone from the girl who was told to leave quietly to the young woman people now turn to for strength. And maybe, just maybe, this was what my father had meant all along. Our struggles are never just ours. Months passed, and the memory of Whitaker's cruel dismissal no longer haunted me. It fueled me. The more I spoke, the more invitations arrived, sometimes from places I never expected. One day, an email popped into my inbox from a producer at a regional TV station. "Maya, we've heard about the talks you've been giving in schools and libraries. We'd love to feature your story in a segment on young community leaders." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Me? On TV? My instinct was to say no. I was still the same girl who used to sit quietly at the back of class, afraid of drawing attention. But then I thought about that 15-year-old girl at the library, the one who said my story gave her courage. If I said no, maybe someone else like her would never hear it. So I said yes. On the day of the interview, the studio lights felt harsh, almost blinding. But when the cameras rolled, I remembered what my father always told me. Speak as if you're talking to one person who needs to hear it most. So I did. I spoke about growing up Latina in Boston, about watching my parents work jobs where people looked right through them, and about the day I was told to leave quietly. The clip aired that week, and I thought it would end there. But it didn't. Within days, it spread on social media. Messages poured in from strangers across the country. Some said, "I've been there." Others wrote, "Your story gave me courage at work today." Then came another unexpected call, this time from a prestigious art foundation in New York. They offered me a scholarship to pursue visual arts and leadership training. The woman on the line said, "We see potential in you, Maya." not just as an artist, but as a voice. I couldn't believe it. I remembered standing in Whitaker's gallery, heat in my cheeks, hands trembling as people laughed. Now, here I was, being told I had a voice worth investing in. But success wasn't just about me anymore. I wanted to give back. So when I returned home on weekends, I started helping organize free art workshops for kids in my neighborhood. We painted murals on abandoned walls, murals that told stories of resilience, family, and hope. Little by little, the gray corners of the city came alive with color. One Saturday, as we finished a mural of clasped hands stretching across a broken street, a middle-aged man stopped to watch. His eyes lingered for a long time before he spoke. "My son was stopped last year, treated like he didn't belong. Thank you for doing this." His voice cracked, and I realized again, these murals weren't just paint, they were healing. Meanwhile, news about Whitaker trickled in. His attempt to restart his gallery in another city failed. Rumors said no one wanted to work with him, not after the truth about his behavior became public. At first, I felt vindicated, but then, strangely, I just felt sad. Sad that someone with so much privilege had chosen arrogance over humanity and lost everything that really mattered. My own world, however, kept expanding. Invitations from universities, panels on diversity in the arts, even community awards began to arrive. Each stage was bigger than the last, but I tried to hold on to humility, reminding myself, this all began with silence breaking inside one room. One evening, after a long day of travel, I sat with my father in the backyard of our small home. He was sipping café con leche, the steam curling in the cool night air. "You've made us proud, mihija," he said softly. I smiled, resting my head on his shoulder. "Papa, I don't feel like I've done anything big," he chuckled. "Sometimes the biggest thing you can do is show people they don't have to bow their heads anymore." His words settled deep inside me. By the end of that year, I was standing on a stage in New York City, speaking at a national conference on youth leadership. The hall was filled with thousands of people, educators, activists, students. The lights were bright, the applause loud. But when I stepped up to the podium, I closed my eyes for a second and pictured that small library room where it all began. Then I spoke, not as a victim of prejudice, but as someone who had transformed pain into purpose. The applause in the New York hall still rang in my ears as I stepped down from the podium. But in my heart, I felt calm rather than triumphant. For me, this wasn't about standing taller than anyone else. It was about making sure the next young girl who walks into a place where she's not supposed to belong doesn't have to shrink herself to fit someone else's narrow view of the world. After the conference, I returned home to Boston for a community gathering at the Neighborhood Cultural Center. It wasn't a glamorous stage, but it mattered to me more than any award. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, teachers, kids who had painted murals with me, and parents who had shared their own stories of being overlooked or doubted. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't stand behind the podium. I stepped right into the crowd, holding the microphone loosely. "I used to think that dignity was something people gave you," I said, my voice steady. "That if someone in power insulted you, maybe it meant you weren't enough." But I was wrong. Dignity isn't something others hand to you. It's something you carry inside, no matter how others treat you. A quiet hush filled the room. People leaned in. Some nodded. Others had tears in their eyes. I continued. "When I walked into that gallery months ago, I was humiliated. I walked out trembling. But what I never expected was that humiliation would become the very seed that grew into courage. And that courage isn't mine alone. It belongs to every one of us who's ever been told we don't belong." The crowd broke into applause, not loud or frenzied, but warm and long, like waves of affirmation. Later that night, I sat with my mom and dad in the kitchen, the air filled with the smell of arroz con pollo she had made for me, just like she used to when I came home from school. My father looked at me with quiet pride, his calloused hands folded on the table. "Maya, you've turned pain into light. That's not easy to do." My mom reached for my hand. "And you didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for others. That's what makes it beautiful." For a moment, I felt tears well in my eyes. Not of sadness, but of release. All those months of holding it in, the shame, the anger, the disbelief, now felt like part of a story much bigger than myself. The next morning, as I walked past one of the murals we had painted, two hands of different colors clasped together, stretching across cracked bricks. I saw a group of kids pointing at it. One of them said, "That's ours. We painted that." I smiled quietly, realizing that they weren't just talking about the wall. They were talking about ownership of their future, their voices, their worth. Meanwhile, word about Whitaker had spread far and wide. His gallery had closed for good. No one wanted to work with him, not because of revenge or boycotts, but because his arrogance had destroyed his own credibility. And for me, that was justice enough. Life had already delivered the consequences he'd earned. I no longer felt anger toward him. In fact, I felt something unexpected. Pity. Pity that he never understood that power built on disrespect is fragile and always collapses under its own weight. That evening, as I wrote in my journal, I reflected on everything: the laughter I endured, the tears I shed in silence, the courage I found, the people I inspired, and the lessons I'd learned. Here's what I wrote. Never let someone else's prejudice define you. Never let their scorn shrink you. The truth is, we are worth more than what they see. Always. Sometimes life uses humiliation as a mirror, forcing us to discover strength we didn't know we had. And when we rise not just for ourselves, but for everyone still fighting to be seen. That's the real victory. I closed the notebook, feeling a peace I had never known before, not because the world had magically changed, but because I had changed, and because I knew others were changing with me. The road ahead would not be easy. Prejudice doesn't disappear overnight. But I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer afraid of the rooms where I was once unwelcome. And the next time I stepped into one, I would carry not only my own dignity, but the strength of every story, every voice, and every mural painted with hope. And that, I realized, was enough to keep walking forward. At the heart of this story lies a timeless truth. Our worth is never defined by how others see us, but by the dignity we carry within. Too often, people are judged by their appearance, background, or social standing, and it can feel like those judgments strip us of our voice. But life has a way of reminding us that prejudice only reveals the weakness of the one who carries it, not of the one who endures it. The real strength is found in holding your head high, in refusing to let humiliation turn into silence, and in transforming pain into purpose. When we dare to stand tall, we not only reclaim our own self-respect, but also open doors for others who are still fighting to be recognized. As the saying goes, what's done in the dark will come to light. And it is often in those very moments of unfairness that we discover the courage we never knew we had. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated or unfairly judged? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If this message touched you, hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss more powerful and thought-provoking stories. Wishing you peace, strength, and the quiet confidence to always walk in your true worth.